In this video, we'll be discussing 15 Amazon Cognito strategies. These tips are from systemsarchitect.io. Every login screen your users see is either building trust or quietly chipping away at it. And Amazon Cognito is the service that decides which one happens. Getting authentication right protects your application and your users, while getting it wrong invites account takeovers, compliance headaches, and frustrated customers abandoning your sign-up flow. This article walks through 15 strategies for using Amazon Cognito to build authentication that is secure, scalable, and genuinely pleasant to use. 15 Amazon Cognito strategies. 1. Enable multi-factor authentication. 2. Utilize user pools and identity pools. 3. Build custom authentication flows. 4. Use the hosted UI or managed login. 5. Integrate with third-party identity providers. 6. Implement attribute-based access control. 7. Enable fine-grained password policies. 8. Use Lambda triggers for custom logic. 9. Monitor user activities with Amazon CloudWatch. 10. Utilize user attribute verification. 11. Enable social sign-in. 12. Deploy in multiple regions for high availability. 13. Utilize data synchronization with AWS AppSync. 14. Secure API access with Cognito identity pools. 15. Regularly review and update security settings. 1. Enable multi-factor authentication. Passwords alone are a thin line of defense, and multi-factor authentication gives Amazon Cognito a second independent layer to check before granting access. Why require a second factor? When MFA is enabled, users confirm their identity with a one-time code delivered by SMS or generated by an authenticator app, which dramatically reduces the risk of account takeover even when a password has been leaked or guessed. Rolling out MFA gradually, starting with admin accounts before extending it to the full user base, tends to ease adoption without overwhelming your support team. A practical tip is to prefer authenticator-app-based TOTP, time-based one-time password, over SMS where possible. 2. Utilize user pools and identity pools. Amazon Cognito actually offers two distinct building blocks. User pools manage your user directory and sign in, while identity pools exchange an authenticated identity for temporary AWS credentials scoped to exactly the permissions that users should have. This keeps your authentication and access logic cleanly separated. A good practice is to map identity pool roles carefully to IAM policies, granting the narrowest set of permissions each role actually needs. 3. Build custom authentication flows. Standard username and password sign-in doesn't fit every business, and Cognito's custom authentication flows let you replace the default challenge response sequence with your own Lambda-triggered logic, from passwordless flows to device-based verification. Designing a custom flow requires careful thought about failure states, since a broken authentication chain can lock users out entirely if not handled gracefully. A useful starting point is to prototype the flow with Cognito's built-in testing tools before rolling it out to production traffic. 4. Use the hosted UI or managed login for simplified integration. Building a secure, polished sign-in page from scratch is more work than most teams expect, and Cognito's hosted UI or managed login gives you a fully managed alternative that handles sign-in, sign-up, and account recovery out of the box. Because AWS maintains and secures it, your team avoids reinventing password reset flows and the many small security details a custom login page needs to get right. A practical tip is to test the redirect flows carefully in your specific app architecture, since mobile and single-page apps sometimes need extra configuration. 5. Integrate with third-party identity providers. Forcing users to create yet another password is a common source of drop-off during sign-up, and integrating Cognito with third-party identity providers removes that friction entirely, supporting Google, Facebook, Apple, and any SAML security assertion markup language or OpenID Connect compatible enterprise system. This tends to increase completed signups and reduce password reset tickets, and lets enterprise customers enforce their own corporate MFA without Cognito replicating that logic itself. A good practice is to map federated user attributes consistently into your Cognito profile. 6. Implement attribute-based access control. Role-based access control works well until your permission requirements get more nuanced than a handful of fixed roles can express. And that's where ABAC, attribute-based access control, comes in. Cognito lets you attach custom attributes like department, region, or subscription tier and combine them with AWS IAM policy conditions. How does ABAC actually work? A single IAM role can grant different effective permissions depending on the user's specific attributes, rather than requiring a separate role for every combination. AYBAC scales far better than role explosion as your permission model grows more complex, so document your attribute to permission mapping clearly. 7. Enable fine-grained password policies. Weak passwords remain one of the most common entry points for account compromise, and Cognito's configurable password policies let you require a minimum length, mandate a mix of uppercase, lowercase numbers and symbols, and set expiration periods appropriate to your risk profile. Account lockout after repeated failed attempts slows down brute force attacks without requiring you to build that logic yourself. A useful habit is to test your password policy against your own sign-up flow, checking current guidance from organizations like NIST along the way. 8. Use Lambda triggers for custom logic. Amazon Cognito's Lambda triggers let you inject custom code at specific points in the authentication lifecycle. Common uses include a pre-sign-up trigger that validates users, a post-confirmation trigger that provisions related resources, or a pre-token generation trigger that adds custom claims, letting you enforce business rules or sync new user data with an external CRM the moment an account is created. This video is a condensed version of what we have on systemsarchitect.io. See the full section there. Also make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel for more, and check the video notes for links. A practical tip is to add detailed logging inside each trigger, since debugging without that visibility is considerably harder. 9. Monitor user activities with Amazon CloudWatch. Authentication problems tend to surface first as patterns in the data, and routing detailed Cognito activity logs to Amazon CloudWatch gives you the visibility to catch those patterns early. Why does this visibility matter? A spike in failed logins from unusual locations can signal a credential stuffing attempt, and CloudWatch alarms let your team respond before it escalates. A good practice is to define your key monitoring thresholds before you need them. 10. Utilize user attribute verification. An unverified email address or phone number is a liability, since it means you can't reliably reach a user or trust that a contact detail belongs to them. So Cognito's built-in verification sends a confirmation code the user must enter before the attribute is marked verified. This matters since password reset and account recovery flows depend on a verified contact method, actually reaching the right person. A practical tip is to make verification feel like a natural part of onboarding. 11. Enable social sign-in. Beyond the security benefits of federation, social sign-in is simply a convenience users expect, letting them log in with an existing Google, Facebook, or Apple account instead of inventing a new password. Does removing a password step really matter? This tends to translate into measurably higher sign-up completion rates, particularly on mobile, and can boost engagement since returning users face less friction on a new device. A useful practice is to still collect a verified email address even for social sign-ins. 12. Deploy in multiple regions for high availability. Authentication is on the critical path for essentially every user interaction, which makes it one of the worst places in your architecture to have a single point of failure. So deploying Cognito user pools and identity pools across multiple AWS regions builds in redundancy and reduces latency for distributed users. Designing this well requires a strategy for keeping user data consistent across regions, since user pools are regional resources that don't automatically replicate. A practical tip is to test your regional failover process regularly, since an untested failover plan often has gaps that only surface during an actual outage. 13. Utilize data synchronization with AWS AppSync. Applications spanning multiple devices need a consistent way to keep user-specific data synchronized, and pairing Cognito's authentication with AWS AppSync gives you exactly that, building real-time, offline-capable data sync on an identity layer you've already configured. AppSync's GraphQL subscriptions push updates to connected clients as soon as data changes, using Cognito-issued tokens for consistent access rules. A good practice is to scope AppSync resolvers tightly to the authenticated user's own data. 14. Secure API access with Cognito identity pools. Handing out long-lived AWS credentials to a mobile or web client is a security risk that Cognito identity pools are specifically designed to eliminate. Once a user authenticates, an identity pool exchanges that identity for short-lived, automatically expiring AWS credentials scoped to an IAM role. What does that actually protect you from? Your client application never stores static AWS access keys, removing an entire category of credential leak risk, and identity pools also support limited guest access for unauthenticated users. A practical tip is to review your identity pool's IAM role permissions on the same cadence as your other security reviews. 15. Regularly review and update security settings. Security configurations that were appropriate when you first set up Cognito can quietly become outdated as your application grows and attack techniques evolve. So periodically review MFA requirements, password policies, and Lambda trigger logic to keep your setup aligned with current best practices. This should also cover access patterns, checking whether IAM roles still reflect the least privilege access your application actually needs, using CloudWatch findings to focus reviews on real observed risk. A practical tip is to assign clear ownership for these periodic reviews. To wrap up, these 15 strategies turn Amazon Cognito from a basic login box into a genuinely robust identity layer for your application. Start with the fundamentals like MFA and strong password policies, then layer in the more advanced strategies like ABAC and cross-region deployment as your scale and risk profile demand it. Revisiting these practices as your user base and threat landscape evolve keeps your authentication as strong as the rest of your architecture. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one. Well, that does it for now. Hope you got something out of this video. Find a lot more articles and guides on both systemsarchitect.io and codeguides.io. That's systemsarchitect.io and codeguides.io.